I hasten to point out that I'm the only person up here who doesn't have a PhD, which is quite intimidating in one way. But in the other way means I get to make broad sweeping statements without any supporting evidence at all, and answer questions with "because I said so." But yeah, so what I'm going to do, I'm a travel writer by trade, probably is the most appropriate description. And in recent years I've started walking a lot for these journeys, which means I kind of pass through and stay in a lot of cities, which I think is why Caroline has invited me here today. So what I'm going to do is just kind of a few random things that have come into my head when thinking about what to say here, and experiences I've had, and kind of vague theories I've come up with. So I'll just crack on with that. I mean, I'm from South East London, and I live in Deptford, right on the River Thames, and I live on the corner of Deptford Creek and the River Thames. And I think London's obviously a big city. See, this is the kind of academic insight you're going to get from me. London is a big city, and I think it's possibly hard to make one historical narrative about London, because I think the same with any city, there are whole loads of strands, whole loads of layers of history and themes of history running through cities, and one of those obviously is a sense of place. And my locality, even out of my window, I'm very lucky to have a lot of different types of history. For example, where I live on Deptford Creek, if I look out of my living room window, I see the bank of Deptford Creek. And the bank of Deptford Creek there is where, when Sir Francis Drake came back in the Golden Hind, that's where he parked it, on the corner of Deptford Creek and the River Thames. And it's where Queen Elizabeth I came down and knighted him on the Golden Hind. And it was left there. It was kind of an early tourist attraction, actually, but it was left there, and obviously they didn't have any kind of restoration technique, so it eventually fell apart and just kind of sank into the mud and slime of Deptford Creek. So sometimes when I see people out the window wandering past that bit of the creek, and they're looking, because it's on the Thames Path as well, so you get a lot of people going past, and sometimes I want to kind of lean out the window and go, you know what's there, right under there? It's the Golden Hind. But I'd never do that because they'd probably call a policeman or something. But I get very enthusiastic about finding layers of history in different places, and if I look across the river through my other living room window, I can see where the Edinburgh Kingdom Brunel's Great Eastern was built and launched kind of disastrously. Actually, it took about 3 weeks to get it down the slipway, I think, despite all the pomp and circumstance. And so I can look out and see that. And then if I look a bit further around the river, there's a place called Enderby's Wharf, which is where the first transatlantic cable was made, that connected Britain and America, and kind of clanged the two continents together in instant communication, or almost instant communication. And so that kind of fascinates me, that I can see all that kind of history. And if I look out of my bedroom window, I can see the Royal Observatory in Greenwich Park at the top of the hill, which it's the prime meridian starts there, 0 degrees, and you can go up to Greenwich Park and hop between the eastern and western hemispheres, which lots of people do. And lots of European kids have started doing that, putting padlocks on the gates there, and to seal their love and all that, and then a fella comes along with a big set of clippers at the end of the day and cuts them all off. But so I'm quite lucky in that I can stand in one spot and turn and look out of different windows and see all sorts of historical events, themes, and history. Which, with the developments of the riverside in London, and you've got loads of new apartment buildings and all that kind of thing, none of it's visible. I mean, where the Great Eastern was built, they have left some of the supports for the slipway, where they had the disastrous launch of the Great Eastern. They had to launch it side on, which is quite unusual for a ship, because it was so big that if they'd launched it end on, it would have ended up in Deptford High Street, which probably wouldn't have been very helpful. But so there's that they're kind of big marquee events in history. But I'm working on a book at the moment on a place that's slightly further round the Thames. Can't quite see it from my window, unfortunately, but if I go to the bank of the river, I can see it. And it's a place called Silvertown, which sounds really nice, pleasant and glamorous, but it was named after Samuel Winkworth Silver, who founded a rubber factory there, and that was the first thing on this bank, on this marshy bit just north of the Thames there. And Silvertown began in about it was 1850 that they started this rubber factory, and so lots of people worked there, and so this place really grew up very quickly, which made it a shithole, basically. Silvertown, it was a pretty grim place, and that's where my family's from. And I'm writing a book at the moment about the street that my family lived on, that my grandparents and great-grandparents lived on between the wars, and it's only a fairly normal street called Constant Street. It's got these days it's got the Thames to the south, it's got City Airport to the north, but in those days it was part of a very strong community, and a very close community. It was a dockland community. It was all dock workers that lived there. Like my family are all dockers basically. And my great-grandparents had a ship's laundry there, and so you had everything, all this. It was one of the busiest ports in the world at the time, so you had all this industrial stuff going on, and imports and exports, and people, stevedores unloading all these things. There's a terrific picture of my uncle with my granddad when he was a little boy. It must have been in one of the papers. It's a really good quality picture, and he's holding his hand out, and there's an elephant in a wooden cage, and his trunk's coming through the cage and touching my uncle's finger, which you'd see amazing things in Silvertown. But Constant Street was this very close community, and my grandparents and my great aunts would talk about it like it was the most amazing heavenly place in the world. And the book I'm writing is the story of this place between the wars, although I'm starting in 1917 because Silvertown was blown to pieces in 1917 because they had the bright idea of putting a munitions factory there at the end of Constant Street, well, a bit further along, and it blew up, and being in the middle of a densely packed residential area, in fact, only 90 people died, which is a miracle. But there was this huge explosion in Silvertown, which was one of the biggest explosions in British history. You could hear it in Norwich, apparently, but probably in most things in Norwich if you stay there long enough. But and then you go through all the kind of social history between the two. The Spanish flu epidemic, the general strike. All the sorts of things that were going on in the 1930s, the growth of sport as entertainment, the Greyhound Stadium, Speedway even got quite popular, and then it all came to an end on the 7th of September 1940 when the Germans came, and there was the first day of the Blitz, and Silvertown was all but destroyed. Constant Street was certainly destroyed, and so I go back there now, and all that's left of Constant Street is a little inlet, and then it becomes a car park to some flats. So there's this little stubby bit of Constant Street left, and there's only one building left from that time, which I think was the post office, but that's all that's left. And sometimes I go there and just look at this building and look at the rest of the street, and I think there was so much history there of a certain kind, of a social kind, a particular type of people, and a particular industrial history, a particular community history there that's all gone, but it's there under your feet. And I think that's a kind of fascinating subject, and I'm going to do a terrible name drop here, but at the moment I'm working on a book with Bernard Sumner, and it's telling his life story, and he's obviously held up as this great icon of Manchester and Manchester-ness, but he's got interesting theories, interesting things to say about it, because he was born in Lower Broughton in Salford, in a really poor, very poor part of even Salford, and Salford was never a particularly rich place. In fact, Lower Broughton is the Ewan McColl song "Dirty Old Town" was written about Lower Broughton, and it was a pretty rough place. But he said the same thing that I've been saying about Constant Street, in that he had a very close community on the street he lived on, Alfred Street, and a lot of his family lived on the same street, and friends lived on the same street. And then in the 1960s, the slum clearance programs came along, and they knocked down all these streets and moved all the populations out into tower blocks all over. All across Manchester, and Bernard says that whole community thing absolutely disappeared in a heartbeat, and he tells these amazing tragic stories of his grandmother living in one of the end houses in Alfred Street, and they're going along slowly. The families are moving out, and the houses are being boarded up, and he said everything he knew was just being wiped out, and there was nothing he could do about it. So I think there's an interesting side of history there for me, anyway, in that kind of close-knit, small microcosms of society that have their own histories that are a part of a greater narrative. And I think, defining the character of a city is very hard, and I try to do that by walking around them and walking through them. And one of my favourite examples of walking through a city and its history is Sarajevo, which is probably my favourite city in the world, actually, and it's very unlucky, Sarajevo, because it's known for being the location of where the First World, the thing that pushed the first domino over that led to the First World War, and then the terrible events of the early 90s, the Bosnian War and the siege of Sarajevo and all that, because Sarajevo actually has always had this reputation as being a very cosmopolitan place. It's on one of the main routes between Europe and Asia, so there's always a real mix of people there, and they were always very proud of the fact that on a roughly square of about 200 yards, you had the main mosque of Sarajevo, you had the Catholic Church, the Serbian Orthodox Church, and the synagogue were all within literally a stone's throw of each other, and they're always very proud of that. But we always think of Sarajevo as these, thanks to these terrible events. But Sarajevo was in a valley, so when it grew, it couldn't grow outwards; it had to grow lengthways. So if you go to Sarajevo, and you can actually walk through the history of the city, which is a really interesting thing to do. And you start in the very old part of town, which is like the very old kind of Turkish buildings, these low wooden buildings that were protected from the shelling, actually, because the high-rise buildings all around in the way, so they kind of survived the war. And then you move along through the city, and you come to the kind of Austro-Hungarian architecture, and then you move along and you come to the Yugoslavian architecture, and you go right up to the kind of bizarre yellow cube of the Holiday Inn, which was built for the 1984 Winter Olympics in Serbia, and you've got the Olympic Stadium just up the road there. So in about 40 minutes, it's possible to walk through the entire history of Sarajevo, all of which is underpinned by the scars from the conflict of the early 90s. They have these things on the pavement called Sarajevo roses, which are these star-shaped gouges in the streets where the shells landed, and they filled them with red rubber, and it's really effective. And so you get these red kind of star-shaped gashes in the tarmac to remind you constantly. And every building, I mean, I haven't been there for about 5 years now, but on every building of every vintage, you could see scars from that conflict with shrapnel and machine gun fire in all the buildings, and the Bosnian Parliament building, which was built in the 1960s, was all burnt out and shelled, and there was a constant reminder of that. But I mean, that's a really easy place to walk through the history of a city. But that is one of my favourite places, and I think it's a really good example of it. And the other week, I walked to Belgium. Went out for a pint of milk, just lost the run of myself, you know, the way it happens. But I went to Ypres, which is, and I thought about this session tonight when I was there, because Ypres is a really interesting place for lots of reasons, but certainly from evidence of history reasons. What happened, and as everybody knows, Ypres was totally destroyed in the First World War, absolutely flattened. And there was really nothing left of it at all, apart from the medieval city ramparts that they kind of survived. But the town itself and the main square was absolutely flattened. And after the war, what they did was, instead of, they could have abandoned the place altogether, they could have built a whole new city. But what they did, they said, we're going to rebuild it just as it was in June 1914, before all this kicked off. And they've done it. And when you go to the main square, the Grote Markt in Ypres, you've got this incredible, the Cloth Hall, which originally was a 12th century building, where Ypres was a big textile place, mentioned in the Canterbury Tales in connection with that. But they've rebuilt it, and it's an incredible building, and it looks old, it looks that kind of vintage, as does everything else around that main square. All the buildings are exactly as they were before 1914. And that raises a few questions that I'm probably not clever enough to ask, let alone answer. But I think the fact, that they thought, we're not going to let this war defeat us, we're not going to let it kind of, force us out. We're going to show that Ypres can literally rise from this disaster. And one thing I found interesting was that the main First World War museum, called In Flanders Fields, is inside the Cloth Hall. And it's a brand new relaunched museum. It's all got interactive experiences and all this kind of thing. But I remember looking at some of the exhibits and looking up at the ceiling. It's amazing vaulted ceiling with wooden supports, and thinking, it's like Ypres has risen up and closed over the First World War. So I thought that was a really good image of how the city hadn't been beaten by it. But this reconstruction of its history, it's kind of making a replica of a city that's real. I don't know. Maybe that's stretching things too far, but I also passed through a town called Dixmude, which the same thing happened there. It was completely flattened in the war, and they rebuilt the whole city. And the real brain-bending thing for me was I was sitting in the square, and they're restoring the town hall, and there's a thing hanging on the front of it, which is going to show you what it's going to look like when it's finished being restored. And I thought, well, it was built when it was destroyed, then it was rebuilt, now it's being restored. Now they've got a big picture on the front showing what it will look like, which is what it used to look like. And I thought, if I think about it anymore, the whole universe would fold up into itself and disappear like the house at the end of Poltergeist. So, but I mean, they're fairly random observations, so I'll probably stop talking now in great big non sequiturs. But for me, the best way to get out among and experience history in a city is to walk. You know, it sounds simple, it sounds trite, it probably is, but it's to walk and look up, because you know it's all around history of every type: industrial, royal, social history. Cities are rich in them, and that's why I enjoy walking through them and writing books that kind of tell stories about them. And that's about all I have to say, I think. So.